All right, good people. Here we go. Excited to tap in and talk about some really cool topics here as we continue our full stack journey. And most importantly, thank y'all for being a part of this. And I appreciate y'all for coming back. And second of all, let's talk about some full stack concepts here. So we started a long time ago having a conversation about what it meant to be working in a full stack context, right? We talked about how a modern full stack developer has to concern themselves with two parts of the stack, right? The front end and the back end. And on the front end side, we've talked a lot about what that means. We went from HTML all the way to React. And hopefully, if you've been following along these last few sessions and weeks and everything, you understand what I'm talking about. When we say front end application, we're talking about client facing applications, things that a client and a user would see and interact with readily on their computer. And the idea of a client side application is only made real when we think about the other side of the stack, which is the back end of the application. And the back end typically refers to all of the logic and functionality that takes place on a receiving server. So the front end is the client side making requests to a server, and the back end is the server side that is responding to the requests made by a particular client. So give me a thumbs up real quick if you just kind of vaguely remember those topics. We talked about it a while back, and it's a pretty important kind of concept to understand that relationship between clients and servers too, as we start thinking about what does it mean being in this full stack context. All right, cool. So one sec, y'all. See that my John is lagging a bit, so I'm trying to fix that real quick. So we have the opportunity to continue our journey into the stack and to think a little bit deeper about what does it now mean to bridge the front end to the back end and start building more full stack applications. And so my goal is to really kind of get us acclimated today into some of what it would take for us to think in a full stack context, moving from the front end to the back end, and talk a little bit about what happens in the middle in that bridge. So that is the goal for today. Appreciate it for y'all sticking around, and let's get to it. So first thing I want to do is I actually want to pull up the project that we were working on last session. One, selfishly, just to show y'all that I got it to work. and then two, unselfishly, to talk about what it's doing and how we might extend this to this application to allow us to kind of understand how will we start to get this into a full stack context. So I know it says it's taking a minute to load. So I'm just trying to wait for the screen to load. All right, cool. Give me a thumbs up if y'all can see the screen right now. I know it took like forever. Took forever in the day. All right, groovy. Thank y'all. So we started working on this application last couple sessions ago. It's called What's Up, and it's a pretty simple application for the most part. When users first come to the site, they're presented with two options. One is to log in, the other is to sign up. We assume we skipped a lot of the logic for logging in and all of that. Maybe we add that toward the end of our time building on this application. But for the most part, right, we just tried to show the idea of different states being rendered on our application. So right now, when somebody logs in without getting their information and whatnot, in that like traditional sense, we pull up a dashboard, and the dashboard has all of these messages that the users have written and saved into local storage. And so we added the local storage saving last session. So if you're interested in how do we get these to save and pull back up, that's how we did it with local storage. So now whenever a user types a message, this is a new message. I have a lot of test messages, dumb test messages in here. So we got the still alert. Maybe I should remove that alert. But if we scroll down here, we see that that message was written. This is a new message. Clearly, I got a lot of tests in here, test cases that save. So first thing I want to do is to pull up the code so we can talk through this. Maybe I'll show y'all how you can clear out this like cache of local storage data because it definitely gets a little annoying if you're saving everything to local storage. So let's switch over to VS Code and chat about what's going on in this code real quick. So here we are in the VS Code coding landscape, and we have an opportunity to touch base on what's going on here, right? So just kind of a quick overview for anybody that's just looking at this code for the first time. We started the app off just with like as a lesson in kind of learning how to work with state and props. So essentially, we created a conditional rendering statement that allows for us to handle that, whether user click login or whether user click sign up, which component do we show for them, right? So if a user clicks login, we show them this login component, or if they click sign up, we show them the sign up component. The login component is the main component for our work here, and we use it to really kind of create the entire flow of what the user sees and what we just showed online. So right now, if we go to the login component, what we'll see is that this component is rendering just our dashboard. And the dashboard is essentially another component that, hey, once we log in, cool, we're showing the user the dashboard. There's some definitely better ways that we can structure this kind of navigational logic that we have here, but we're just kind of using some basic React concepts, stacking them all together to just show us how to do it. So all of the login component is responsible for is just rendering the dashboard component. So technically, if we want to see all of our visual elements that we saw, like the messages and everything, it will all be in the dashboard component. And the dashboard component is here, right? And so what we're doing is there's three components that make up the dashboard. One is like the message list, which is that big list of messages that we saw on the example. The other is a form, which we also saw, which is what took in the input and allowed us to create a new message. And then the message component, which is the component that we use to visually create like what is an individual message in the message list. So those three components make up our dashboard's logic, right? And so basically, to start off talking about the dashboard or any component really, I know there's a lot of code at the top, but typically what I like to do is go to the bottom to look at the render statement to just get a sense, or the return statement, excuse me, to get a sense as to what's going on when this component renders, right? So whenever we create a dashboard, we're actually creating this div with a message that says this is my dashboard as a heading. We render that form element that we just talked about, and we render another paragraph that says here are our messages, and then the message list component. So just like we've talked about before, we're just using some JSX here to create different elements to create different elements that are essentially responsible for the visual elements that we see eventually on our application. So the dashboard component is a parent component to our form and our message list, which are being rendered inside of the dashboard, right? So this component structure is important because, like we were talking about in our last session, there are many times where we have multiple components that need some type of way for them to communicate to one another. So our form component, if we take a look at that, our form component is just a simple form, right? It has a label and an input and a submit button. And the submit button, when it finally submits the form, it ends up basically the form does a couple functions. One is to the event.prevent default, which is using the event object in order to stop the page from refreshing. That's a helpful function when you know you're changing, when you're working with forms specifically. It comes in handy a lot because forms by default will reload the page after somebody submits them. So you have to tell the form, hey, don't reload the page. This was that alert that I said maybe I want to take away. So I'm actually just going to comment this out real quick. And then essentially what we wanted the form to do was, hey, once you collect this information, we want you to send it to basically send it to the message list, right? And we were talking about how difficult it kind of is for the form to send data all the way to the message list because the message list exists in a completely different component that is outside of the form component. So we were trying to figure out how we pass data from this component to the other component. And now we talked a lot about this in the last few sessions, right? There's only one way that you can pass data from one component to another component, and that is using props. So we know that we can use props to pass data down, right? So like right now, the dashboard component can pass data down to the form, down to message list by defining it here, right? But it's always interesting when you want to pass data either up, right? Like up to a parent component, or beyond just passing it up to a parent component, passing it to any other component, right? That is not necessarily a child's component of the component you're talking about. So the form, right? If the form had any other components in here, like the label, the input, right? We can pass props down pretty easily. Just keep passing them down and defining them and passing them down. But when we want to pass props up, or we want to pass props to a different sibling component, if you will, that's when things really become important. That's when the style and the architecture of how you build your component hierarchy becomes important. So you don't have, if you want to grab props, right? The only thing you need to do is you need to make sure that you add it as an argument into your component to use within the component's function. So you just basically say, hey, this component is going to receive props as an argument. And then you can make use of the props variable with the different props as objects inside of that variable. So we use the dot syntax to refer to that particular bit of data. So in the form, we have the prop for, in the form, we had to pass down a prop to the form because we wanted to create this kind of notification structure. And the reason why is because the only way, and this is a big point, the only way for us to pass data from one component to a sibling component, right? And the reason I called this a sibling component is because both the form and the message list are defined and rendered in the same overarching component or parent component, right? So the parent of both of these, the form and the message list, is the dashboard, right? So the dashboard being the parent makes the form and the message list and any other components rendered in here siblings, right? They're all related to the same parent, if you think about what it means to be a sibling. So to pass data from one component to a sibling component, or to a component that is not even in its own original, like, an ancestral component, like maybe a component from a different, ways away up, we have to create these kind of notification structures where we pass a function to our child and say, hey, when you're ready to send this back, call this function. So we pass a function as a prop that then the sibling, or that the child component calls. And when the child component calls that particular function, right, then the parent gets notified. And when the parent gets notified, then the sibling can get notified. And this is just like real life, you know what I'm saying? Like, you want to get your child, you want to get your brother or your sister or, your sibling, and you want something to happen to them, right? Well, you don't have the ability to do anything to them, right? That's your sibling. You know what's going to happen if you try to do something to them. But if you tell your parents, they can go do whatever they need to do to your siblings, right? I think that makes a little bit of sense. Give it a thumbs up if that makes sense. Yeah, I'm saying, like, tell on them. Tell on them. Get them in trouble, right? Yeah. So essentially, talking through the parent is the only way to communicate to a sibling element, right? And so the dashboard plays an important role in this architecture. When we know we want one component to talk to the other, the parent component plays a very important role in facilitating the conversation. And it does that by taking the props that get called back from that pass down prop function, right? In this case, the forms pass down props function was this on new message prop that has this function, new message notification. New message notification is a function in the parent that gets called whenever the form says, hey, props.on new message. And the form does that anytime it gets submitted. When the form gets submitted, it calls props on new message with that message, thereby sending that message back to the parent component through the new message notification method, right? This new message is the same data as this message that the form calls for itself. And so when we receive this notification, this is where I was talking about the parent plays a very important role, because what the logic says is in order for us to send this data down to the child, we need to save this data in state, in the parent state, so that the parent has knowledge of it, but can tell the sibling component, hey, I'm going to be passing you some data. Don't worry about it yet, but I'm going to be passing you some data, right? And so new message notification is essentially a function where whenever it gets submitted, the parent updates the state and basically says, hey, I want to take all those messages that I've written and add the new message to it, right? That's why the message is adding all the way at the bottom, right? So it's taking the big list of messages that we already have and adding a new message to it. If I wanted the message to come at the top, right? You know, some apps do that where like the message would be actually at the top. We could restructure this array like this and say, hey, you know, we're going to create a new array. New message will be at the front. And then you see this ... and you might be wondering what's going on here. This is called the spread operator. And the spread operator is essentially a operator you can use in JavaScript with arrays and with objects to basically say, take all of the data inside of this object and pass it into this other object. So because we have messages is already an array, right? And it has some data inside of it. By saying ... messages, we're saying take all of the elements in the array, right? And essentially, we're listing that as an item in this new array. So essentially what it's doing is creating a new array with the first item being this new message, and then all of the corresponding items in the messages will get added as separate items in that same array. So that's the spread operator, and we're using that there. And essentially, we're setting the state with this new array, right? And the state is we're using the use state here to store all of our messages. And we set the messages using the set messages function to change the state. And as you can see, that all of this is related to an array. That array started off empty, but over time, as we were adding messages, new message notification kept getting called. We kept setting the messages with setting a new array by adding this new message to it. And then eventually we talked about how we were going to save this data, because it's cool to do that, right? We're saving this data to local storage by setting the item that is basically that same array, right? So essentially, what we're able to do here is local storage is basically taking that same object and writing it as data that we can pull back. Local storage is an API in JavaScript. If you didn't see our glass session, local storage is an API in JavaScript that allows us to save data into the local user's browser, and we can pull that data back. Now, local storage is a great solution for like small bits of data, like that are non-threatening for the user, but you don't typically want to save a lot of data in local storage because it's it could be a security issue if you don't process that data effectively, but it also is it's just not a scalable solution for different types of data. We can only store strings in local storage, right? And so not all the time is it that we have just strings. And we talked about how we could use the JSON library to make this array, which isn't also a string, into a string. But over time, you can imagine like, hey, you know, I might want to just save different types of data. And the fact is with local storage, you can't do that. So Local storage is a great temporary solution. It's great to test like saving. It works really easily. You set an item to local storage with a key, and then later you can pull that same item back from local storage by calling get item with that key. And so essentially how our application works is the form notifies the parent creates and saves a new version of the state, and the message list is given a copy of the state as props, which it uses to render its list of messages. So because messages is state data, right? That means that anytime this state changes, this component that is getting the state, the message list, is always going to change as well. There's going to be new data in that message list component anytime the form updates, because the form tells the dashboard parent to change the state. That once the parent changes the state, this component that was already connected to the state says, okay, I have to change because the state is now different. If that makes sense to you in terms of just the flow of the data, give me a thumbs up because like I said, it's a pretty important concept, comes up very often when we're working with React, and turns out to be like one of the most important hierarchical design patterns when it comes to working with state and props and everything like that. Cool. Appreciate y'all. See a couple thumbs in there. All right, so dope. So that's kind of what we got to so far. That's what's happening and how our application works. And one thing I want to show you is just the fact that all these messages are a little overwhelming. So what I want to do is I want to create a opportunity for us to just clear the local storage. So we talked about the use effect hook last session as well. The use effect hook is just like the use state hook. They're both pre-built in functional hooks in React that essentially work on adding specific logic to our component. The use state hook adds the state logic to our component, allowing for our component to keep track of the state the way that we're doing here on line 14. The use effect hook allows for our component to notice when specific data changes and essentially call a function when something is changing. And the use effect hook is useful for when you want to monitor when specific data changes. So like, for instance, if I wanted to run a particular bit of code whenever the message's state changes, right, I could use this use effect to do that. Whereas if I want to just run some general code anytime the application is being run, I could use this use effect hook, which takes in no parameters. Essentially, in this array, you would put any of the variables or the state data that you that might be changing that you would want this use effect to run whenever that data changes. If you pass it without any parameters, you essentially are telling this use effect to run when the component's data changes for the first time, which happens when it first gets loaded and mounted, and then subsequently as the component, as users interact with the component. So to further illustrate kind of what's going on here, I'm just going to create a different use effect. This time, well, I'll keep this one here as an example, but this time what I want to do is just kind of create a use effect. Again, the point of this one is to run when the component first loads, only so that I can clear out the cache of data. So what I will do is I just want to show y'all this method that we can use within with the local storage API to clear the items. And it's very simple. You call local storage dot clear. And clear is a function that will clear out all of the values in the local storage. So if I were to save this, and I believe that just will update our app here. So just to test it, I'm just going to refresh and just go back to the dashboard. Make sure everything works as It should. Sorry, my computer is acting slow today. Okay, so let's see. Okay, so what I'm gonna do first is, let me just comment out our logic for saving and pulling all of our data. We can keep this one in here. And there you go. So this use effect ran and cleared out all of our local storage data. So if you wanted to figure out how to clear that data, all you need to do is run that clear method so that you're dealing with fresh local storage. So I kept these separate because this use effect is responsible for pulling the data. And I'm assuming that because this one ran first, right? It pulled the data, saved it in the state, and then the local storage was cleared, but you wouldn't see it because the array was already populated. So essentially, the order matters in the use effects, right? Unless, of course, you have a use effect that's listening for specific data. So in this case, this use effect will only run when the messages gets changed. So maybe if I had actually opened the console at that time, we would have saw that the state changed with the messages, and that would have been actually pretty dope to see. Either way, the real big point I was trying to make was local storage.clear is how we could clear the local storage if you don't want all of that information. So cool. So this is dope. This is basically kind of a recap of what we did last. We have a lot of really interesting pieces to this application, but of course we want to start figuring out a little bit more about how we can start to make these applications closer to larger full stack apps. And so what I wanted to do right now is just transition, right? Because I would say right now we have a pretty decent setup here, right? We have an application that is doing a good job at rendering all the things that we need in this kind of dynamic way. And matter of fact, I don't even think we realistically, right? I was doing the original bit of code with the login sign up to just talk about the conditional rendering. But in a big picture sense, right, we could just make it so that the app right now, right, instead of doing all this complicated stuff, we could just render the dashboard if we chose to as well. So maybe later I might choose to do that just to make it just easier for us to just load the page faster. I could do that actually very easily right now. No, it's okay. I'll do it a little bit. So anyway, we have this dope situation here. Oh, my bad. I didn't even show y'all this. So clearly our dashboard refreshed without the messages, so that local storage clear worked, and we're able to now see a clear dashboard, right? Because that local storage use effect worked out for us there. So dope. So that was one thing worth seeing. So what happens next, right? Well, what should we be doing now, right? Well, I just told y'all that local storage isn't the most ideal space for saving data. And right, like when we think about saving data, application data, right, a lot of times what you'll hear is, hey, we want to save this data in a database, right? Or, that just kind of makes sense, right? If we have a lot of data, maybe we have millions of messages, millions of users, everything, right? Local storage isn't going to be able to handle that. And what if a user wants to get data from a different user's messages, right? It wouldn't work if all that data is only in local storage. We would need some objective third party that we could both get the data from that has access to both pieces of data, right? And that's one of the reasons why we like databases, is because different applications can connect to that database to get the same data. So working with databases is definitely something that would make this application a little bit more sophisticated, right? Give us a little bit more weight in our app. But in order for us to even start the conversation about talking about databases and all of these really fantastic things, we have to go back to this conversation about servers, right? And clients and servers and how they work, and how do we use clients and servers in the process of building out our full stack applications, right? So that's what we're going to do is we're going to kind of transition a little bit away from where we are now and talk a little bit more on the server side of the application in order to move into a direction where eventually we can do things like host our application or add a database to it, right? All those things typically require a server. And the only reason I say typically is because there's some, well, they always require a server. Let's put it that way. But there's some solutions where you don't have to be the one making the server nowadays, privileges. But most times you are the person building out the server. And so in order to get a better understanding of even how cloud computing, serverless computing, all of that stuff works, it's going to be helpful to start with building your own servers out. And that's exactly what we're going to do today is build our first server and talk about it and then connect it to our client side application here so that we can see that interchange of data from the server to the client. So if you're ready for that and you're ready for what we're going into now, just give me a thumbs up so I know y'all rocking with me and y'all didn't let the mundane Monday hit you and we still out here. All right, that's what I like to see. What's good? What's good, y'all? What's good? Nice to see y'all. Yeah. All right, dope. So let's switch gears and we're gonna start a conversation talking about the client and the server side a little bit more. So let me stop sharing real quick. And one thing I want to do is just pull up for y'all, if I can find it very fast. Let's see. Is this my drawing? Okay. I want to show y'all this graphic we talked about a while back. Just got to pull it up. Pardon me for the delay. Sometimes you want to have these things prepared, but then sometimes you don't. So let me just pull it up. Y'all know the vibes. I just got so much going on. This computer is just, it's like, bruh. So I just wanna, and if I can't find it in the next couple seconds, I'm gonna just pull up an image so we can talk about it. But it would be cool, I think, for your brains to see the same thing you started with. Oh, perfect. I found it. Mashallah. All right, look. So we started having all these discussions, and we had this really amazing, well-styled, beautiful document that I showed y'all at the start, right? And I told y'all there was only gonna be one of these, and there really was only one of these, right? So scrolling down, this is, remember, if you remember this was the first presentation we talked about when we started talking about the web, right? What is the difference between the web and the internet? We talked about how the internet is a network of networks, right? And the way that the internet works is those networks are using a shared data communication protocol in order to access data from one computer network to another computer network. And inside those computer networks, computers can share data with one another through similar internet protocols. We talked about the web being one of those ways of transferring data and how it did that with HTTP, right? And HTTP and the whole way that the web works is by way of creating connections between clients and servers, right? As a client, we're searching for web domains. Those domains come back with a particular server's IP address, and then we make a connection that allow for us to interact with that server's resources. That whole model is structured in what we call the client server model. And the client server model looks something like this, right? Where a client, anybody who has a computer can make a request to a server, and the server sends back a response to that client with specific types of data, right? And we talked about how this request response cycle is what HTTP allows us to do as it relates to us sending data between clients and servers. The idea is that a request is passing specific information to the server that says, hey, I'm looking to access your data in this capacity. And the server responds to that request with specific data that it says, okay, based on the request I just heard you make, here's my response. Here's the data that I have for you as a response, right? The person making the request or the computer making the request is considered the client, and the computer that responds to that request is considered the server. So depending on what side of this paradigm you're on, you're either the client or the server. And that's how all of this, how the relationship between data works as it relates to clients and servers. And we talked a lot about, so we also talked about some of these particular HTTP methods, right? So when we're making a request to a server, there's a couple different types of methods that we might tell the server, hey, I'm trying to get data from you, or I'm trying to post data, I'm trying to delete data or put or patch data, right? And the server will be looking and listening for these different HTTP methods in order to then process them and generate a response to the client. The response typically contains some status code so that this client can process whether it was successful, whether something got redirected, whether there was an error in the request, or whether there was an error in the server generating a response. Lastly, we talked about how all this comes back together into the full stack context, because client-side programming is where we spend the majority of the time as front-end development, because that's where users are interacting with things, where they need to see things. That's where the React part of our application tends to live, is the client side. And the server side is where our server and all of the code that relates to the server are taking place there in the back end. And we've got to work on both sides of the stack to create what we consider full stack applications. So right now, we're in a great place, I think, with our understanding of the front end. So now we're going to transition a little bit into talking about server-side code and moving into building out servers using JavaScript, because it'll just make our life a little easier now that we know a little bit of JavaScript and are working with React to do a little bit more work with the stack in JavaScript. And the cool thing is that learning how to work with servers in any capacity will also give you a good understanding of how to do it in new languages as, that you might choose in the future. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually start a new server-side project. And the way we're going to do that, so you just go back to our browser here. We're going to make use of a library called Express, not American Express. I'm sorry that is trying to do that to us, but Express. And Express is a node-based library that we can use in order to, well, they're trying to show me Express for men, everything. This is crazy. This is crazy. They're like, boy, go shopping. We're going to use this node framework called Express, right, to essentially create servers. So Express is a Node.js framework that we can use in order to build out server-side applications. And it's a great, most popular server choice when it comes to working in JavaScript. And the cool thing is that because we already have an understanding of how to work with React-based applications and the environment of React applications, we kind of similarly set up to start working with other Node.js applications like Express and frameworks like Express, excuse me. So to get started with Express, we need to install Express into a project. And so first thing we got to do is actually start a new project. But what's interesting is, well, how are we going to start this project, right? This isn't a React project. So we know we used Create React app before to start these React projects, but how do we start like projects on the server side, especially if we're going to be using Node? So let's talk about that process and build our first web application and use Express as a server to help us do that. Matter of fact, while I'm here, let's just look at the getting started guide because boom, they got it right there. Oh, man, well, look at that. Documentation just coming in clutch. So we already actually have Node installed. So this is actually very simple. First thing we got to do is we got to create a folder for our project. So that's what I'm going to do is let's just go ahead and I'm going to pull up a new terminal and then we can take it from there. So let's see, new terminal, and then I'm going to share my screen for y'all wonderful people. 1 second. Boom. Cool. We got this nice blank terminal here. And actually what I'll do, let me just set this up so it's easier for y'all to see it. Sorry, appreciate y'all's patience. And I'm gonna just pull it all up in the same window. All right, cool. So now we got our terminal. This is the client side stuff, so I don't even need to worry about that. These are my downloads. Got to worry about those. But first thing we want to do is we need to create a new folder. So remember, when you're building all your projects out, all of this matters. Where you save it matters because you need to refer back to those particular things. So there's a lot of ways we could do this. We could just do this straight up through the terminal. We could do this through VS Code. Matter of fact, let's just do it through VS Code so that everybody, no matter what device you're using, we could do it in a similar way. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna just open a new window in VS Code. And all this is saying is, hey, create a folder called My App and go into that directory. Well, cool thing is in VS Code, if I want to do that very easily, I could just I could click open, right? And open will just assume that I'm about to open a folder. And what I like to do is go to my directory where I know I want to save my projects. And is this where I wanted to do this? No, just kidding. It's in here. Right. So here's all my projects I've been working on for y'all. Right. And then if I know I want to create a new folder, boom, create new folder. Right. And in this case, they wanted us to try to call it My App. Like, it doesn't matter what we call it. We're just building our new application out. So I'm going to actually call it, I'm going to call it Express Hello World. Cool. This is just a name for a project, just so I remember what's in here. And I just created a folder, right? So now VS Code is like, all right, cool. You can open that folder. I'm like, boom, yeah, I bet. Let's open it. And the cool thing is, in doing it that way, right? I don't have to use a terminal to start out figuring out where I'm going to save it and everything. And for y'all who are not used to working in the terminal, I know
Professor.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it looks like your laptop's about to die.
Oh yeah, that is. Oh, it's good. It's good. It's good. I got it. It's 30%. We good. We Gucci. I appreciate you though. So doing it this way is helpful for those of y'all who aren't used to working in the terminal. You're not sure like how to navigate through there yet, right? By opening a folder in VS Code, it instantly opens you into that project. And when you go ahead and in that particular project, you should be able to, I don't know why they're tweaking on me and not letting me actually open this terminal real quick. That's wild. They're not them ruining my example here, right? But the idea is when you open the project in VS Code, right? It typically will allow for you to open it so that you can get clear access to the terminal. I think my computer is just bugging, to be honest with you. So I'm gonna just close it and open it again. Just make sure that that's not the case. I can quit this first and do it. Now that I made the folder though, it'd be pretty easy because I just gotta open the folder that I started already. All that other stuff still stands. I think it's an easier way because you just get straight up to the point. So this is that client side stuff we were doing. All right, please. All right, cool. So now it's working. All right, like I said, it's bugging on me. But when you open your project, typically like that same way that I just started it, you should be able to go to terminal, open a new terminal, and then you have literally have the terminal right there, you know? So sometimes that's helpful if you're like getting stuck in like, how do I find out, how do I get into that particular project where I'm supposed to run all these commands and stuff? That is one way that's easy. Of course, if you're cool with navigating the terminal, navigate the terminal. It's good for you. It builds your developer chops. So cool. So now that we have this terminal, we're inside of the project. We basically just did these first two steps, but instead of doing it in a terminal, we did it ourselves. Now we need to create a new node project. A node project is any project that's going to use node and use packages and frameworks that are saved in node, right? And Express is one of those packages. Fun fact, Create React App is another, Create React App uses a number of node packages to run. So it also creates a node project for us as that script is running, right? But we never really see that when it's running the script, but now we get to actually create our own node project for ourselves. So I'm just gonna go ahead and in the terminal now, it says that I want to run the command npm init. And npm init is the command that allows for us to create a new node project by creating a package.json file. So if you remember, we talked a little bit about the package.json file in our React app. It is a file that is important for node applications to have helpful information about the project. So first thing it asks us is, what is the package name going to be? And just like the tutorial says here, probably you could just continue to press enter to accept the defaults up to what is the name of the file, and we'll see that in a second. So package name, what is the name of the package? It gives us a default, which is the same name as our folder. So we're gonna say, yeah, that's cool, press enter. It says version 1. Yeah, that's cool, press enter. Description, I don't have one yet, so just press enter. Entry point. So this is asking us, what is the name of the file gonna be that is going to be the main point of entry for our application, right? By default, it's index.js, but we can have it be anything. And I think in this case, they named it app.js in the tutorial. Sometimes you see people name it server.js. It really is up to you. So just for the sake of following the tutorial, I'll also name it app.js. So you can see a little bit of differentiation here. So app.js test command is if I were testing this app, like what would be the command to test it? Right now, I don't really need much more than just getting that default package in there. So I could just continue to press enter. It asks for a Git repo. You could put a link in there if you wanted to. Keywords to easily search, enter, author. All of this stuff is not necessary right now. And you can, if you were writing open source code or code with a specific license, you could give the license here. But typically, we just press enter. It gives us a breakdown of what that package.json will look like. We type yes, and boom. So now, as you can see, it created this file for us called package.json. This is just like that package.json we saw in the React app, except we just made this one from scratch. It says that our main point of entry is app.js. And we are expecting, we're expecting those things to run the way that it's running, right? And if, for instance, I made a mistake, and let's say I'm like, oh, dang, I don't actually want this to be called app.js. I could change it here to be called server.js or whatever else I need it to be. It was meant that wizard was meant to just get you this file, but you can always make changes to it when you want to. So cool. Now that we have a package.json, the only reason we needed it was so that we can install node libraries into our folder. And the library we want to install right now is Express. And Express is, like I said, is the library in, it's the package that allows for us to create our HTTP servers and to host a server and use HTTP methods in that particular server. So what I'm going to do is inside of the terminal, I'm just going to run npm install Express. And this will run to install all of the packages that Express uses. And again, just like when we were installing stuff for Create React App, we get this node modules folder and this package-lock.json. The node modules is where all of the library files are stored. The package-lock just gets created anytime we install new packages to say like what are the latest packages that were installed, etc. So now that we have Express installed, right? Because now if we open the node modules, if we look down, we can see Express is in here. But all these other things were libraries that Express or any of the libraries Express were using needed in order for us to work with it. So now that we have that, we can start working on creating our first Express app. And so Express is actually really simple. So we can create a new file, and in that file, we're going to create and what we consider a server. And the server is going to be essentially running on a particular port of our machine. And on that port, we can make requests and responses to those requests, much like we talked about with a little bit earlier. So let's just build it out. So what we want to do is we want to create a new file. That file, I'm just going to call it app.js to be consistent with what we said that we were going to use here. So this is a new JavaScript file, right? And now I want to make this file, I can put any JavaScript in here. And just to kind of show you how this works, right? Let's say just to test this, right? I could put a console log in here, console.log, hello world. And if you recall, we already kind of saw like how JavaScript files work outside of the browser when we first started talking about JavaScript and how will we connect, how could we run JavaScript without it being connected to like an HTML page. And I told you that you can always run a JavaScript file once you have Node installed on your machine by calling Node and then the name of the JavaScript file. And so in this example, right, the JavaScript here just did a simple console log. So it console logged out in the terminal, which means that this Node can read this JavaScript file. So anything we write in here can be JavaScript that we expect to run whenever we call Node with the name of that particular file. So similar to this, instead of just doing simple console logs, we can actually use these libraries that we're installing in order to make more complicated and complex JavaScript possible. And in the case of what we're trying to do now, we want to use Express to build out a server. So the first thing we want to do is we need to bring in the Express library. And so we'll do that by requiring in Express. So we'll just say const Express equals require, and we'll just put in a string and say Express. And so you might be looking at this, you might be like, okay, well, what's going on here, right? And essentially, there's two ways that we go about importing and exporting when we're working on full stack applications. In based on the JavaScript version that we're using, we either use the import statement that we're used to with Create React App, or we'll use the Node version of importing and exporting, which is the const require syntax. So essentially what we're doing here is we're just importing Express in our server code, right? So that's step one. We have to bring in Express. And we also, in a lot of ways, I think this is saying to request it at a particular version. Sometimes that helps when you know you want a particular version number associated with your require. But sometimes I haven't seen it. But hey, these is the this is the Express doc. So you know what I'm saying. Let's just follow what they're doing right now, as they probably have the better practice for using things as it is right now. Or maybe it did it already by way of let's just see package JSON. Express, this is already at 4.18. They were saying, okay, yeah, 4.18. So you don't have to do it with that weird thing next to it because it already is getting it from the package JSON. Next, now that we have Express installed, right, we need to create a new Express application. So Express creates an app that essentially runs our server. So what we want to do is create that application. And so we do that by creating a new app variable. So const app, and we're going to say get Express. And Express is actually a function that will run in order to create a new application, Express application. So as you can see, if we hover over it, creates an Express application, and voila. So now that we have our app, we need to create, we have to do a couple things in order to get the server up and running as we would expect. The first thing is we need to define what port is our application gonna run on. So here, as you can see in their example, they gave it port 3000, but we can give this any port number that we want, so long as it follows conventions and doesn't kind of overlap with already existing kind of standardized port numbers. And so certain types of servers and processes run on certain ports just by default. So it's good to like learn which ports are open. Things like 3000, nothing really runs on port 3000. But we saw that when we were working with our React code, that was running on port 3000. So instead of running this one on port 3000, I'm just going to choose a arbitrary port that probably nothing is going to run on, and I'm just going to say const port and set it to 8000. Just some arbitrary number, right? So there we go. The last thing we got to do second to last thing we got to do in order to get this application to run is we got to define what's called a route. And a route is essentially a server is listening for specific routes that a client will be requesting. A client makes a request to a route on the server, and when the server hears that that route was reached, then it will respond to the request, and that's when the client request response lifecycle happens. So what I'm gonna do is go ahead and just kind of clone this route that they have here, and as we see, whoops, didn't do it for your boy. But we're gonna just do app.get, pass in a string to define the route, and then a JavaScript function to basically take place whenever that route gets hit. So essentially what's going on here is we use that Express app that we created. And remember when I said that there's a couple different HTTP routes that can be triggered, or HTTP methods that can be called on our server, right? So there's get, there's app.post, right? There is all types of things that we can call app.post, right? If I didn't want to do posting, I could do app.delete, right? So all those HTTP methods are here. So when we say we're doing the get route, we're basically saying we're asking the server that we want to get some data back from the server, right? So app.get is typically used when we're getting data back. So here, essentially, whenever this route gets called, what's going to happen is this function is going to get called. So we need this function to define what happens when the route gets called, right? So in this case, what we're going to do is a couple things. The first thing is we're going to utilize two variable parameters called rec and res, which are short for request and response. Essentially, the get request and any request in Express, any route in Express takes in two parameters. One is the route that is going to take in, and then it takes in a request handler, and that request handler is essentially a function that is going to handle the request and the response, and they get past that object. Just like our event handler functions got past an event object, these routes in Express get past a request and a response object. So you can give them whatever variable names you want, request, response. The order matters. Request will be first, response will be second. But the name doesn't matter. So you could name this whatever you want. So that's why sometimes you see people shorten it to rec and res just to make it a little bit shorter. Now, with those two variables, we can do certain things like process the request to look at, hey, you know, what was there data that was sent with this request from the client? Did the client need us to do anything else very particular with the data? And we can also respond to the client's request from the server. So what we're going to do is we're just going to respond, and we're going to just use res.send, which is a method that allows us to send data back to the client. And we're going to send back a simple hello world to just get that going. So just say hello world. And cool. So whenever that route gets this route, which is the kind of root route, the default route gets called on port 8000, then we should be able to send hello world back from the server. So the last thing I need to do is actually run the server. And so in order to do that, I can use the app.listen functionality to make that the case. So go ahead and say this. I made port with a capital P, all caps. Sometimes you see people do that. But that doesn't matter so long as the rest of the function is structured the way you expect it to be. So now we have our app. It'll be listening on the port we defined earlier, which is 8000 for me. And when it's running, we'll see a console log to say that it's finally running. And our server should be up. So I'm just going to save the app real quick. And in the terminal, in order for us to run our Express application, we just need to run node app.js one more time. And now, as you can see, we get a little console log that came from the app.listen that says, hey, this is listening on port 8000. So now if I go over to my browser and we go to localhost, and instead of 3, we go to localhost 8000. When it loads, we can see that that data is coming back on the server from the server as data. So we got our hello world going on here. So what's dope is we clearly created the opportunity for our server to run, right? It's running, and we can see it on localhost 8000, just like we could see React's localhost 3000. But when that page first loads, right, with the root route, we get that nice res.send hello world. So take a quick second and try to build this yourself. If you haven't already, follow along. Go ahead and try to build a nice little project real quick to kind of practice this yourself real fast. And like my homegirl suggested, I'm going to run and grab my charger and we can make it happen. All right, y'all. So yeah, just to recap what you got to do if you are trying to build this yourself. First, you just need a new project, right? A new folder with just some no code inside of it. And you need to go into your terminal in that particular folder. All right. In that particular folder, you're going to run the command node npm init, and npm init is going to run this little helpful utility script to help you build out a package.json. And for the most part, you could just kind of allow the defaults. You just got to remember that, hey, the package entry point, the entry point for the package sometimes matters, right? So in this case, I just renamed my package entry point to app.js. Sometimes I keep it as index.js. Sometimes I change it to server.js. That's just up to the project. Everything else, you could just keep pressing enter to finish. It will write your package.json for you. And then you can install Express using npm now that you have a package.json. You have officially a Node project when you have a package.json. So we can use Node to install Express. And once we install Express, it's as simple as just writing the information that we have here to get that server running. And in order to run it, you just want to call in your terminal node with the name of whatever your entry point of your file is so that you can get that up and running on your own. And then all I did was go to my browser at that same particular location in order to test it out and see if it was working. So if you're trying it out and you're experiencing some trouble, stick around and I'm happy to help troubleshoot. But let's keep going and talk a little bit about, okay, now that we have our first route here, what all might we use this server to do for us, right? So let's zoom out for a second. What are servers useful for? Well, on the one hand, right, servers do handle a lot of complex functionality for our application. James said in the chat, storing data, right? If I want to create a database, I need the database hosted on a server, right? So in a lot of ways, there's a relationship that servers have to data as well as to more complex computing that doesn't typically happen on the user side of a computer, right? A large machine learning algorithm typically wouldn't be running on a client's computer, right? That would be happening on your computer and you'd be sending the data back to the client, right? So the server always has kind of this relationship to the client as like, hey, you know, I'm the thing doing the like back behind the scenes work and you get to see what the result of that work is. You don't have to do that complex work yourself. So things like logic for databases, things like logic for like authentication and like handling that flow. A lot of times we're going to use servers for that, right? Another very important thing that is important to name is when we want to host our applications. Like let's say all these React apps we've been making, they're super dope, right? And you might be wondering, well, how do I get this up for somebody to see? Well, the answer is you need it to be running on a server, right? So essentially by having your application tied to having your application on a server, right? Hosting your React application on a server gives you the ability to centrally tie that server to an IP address, right? And then that whole process we just talked about of somebody going to a particular IP address means that they can reach your React, your code, right? So servers are very important in a lot of different ways. And so now that we have our first server kind of up and running, is really great because it's going to allow us to do a little bit more complex things. And so I just want to kind of show us some of those things that might take place when it comes to connecting our server side code with the React code. And this is just to kind of keep experimenting and show y'all a little bit more of what the server might be useful for in a pretty simple to kind of see way. And then we'll keep building on our knowledge of these servers as we keep going on. So let's say I want to take that code that we were working on before, and instead of having it where all of the data was coming from local storage, let's say like that code was coming from maybe a database of some kind, right? So how might we use the server to help us do that, right? How might we use the server to do that? That's kind of what we're going to take the next couple of minutes to figure out real quick for ourselves. So first things first, let me just reshare our current code base, and let me just also pull up the client side stuff. And okay, cool. So I'm just gonna go here. Dope. So this server, right? Whoops. So this, okay, so our our local host right now is running with our running based on that server that we just created. And I lost it. I think I put it in the wrong place. Yeah, here we go. Right. And so we created this server to run on port 8000. And we said, hey, whenever the user goes to get a route from that particular server, we're going to essentially respond with hello world. But what more could we respond with here, right? So the thing is, you can send all types of data into your from the server, right? So you can see some examples here. Here it's showing you, hey, you could send all types of things. You could send HTML, right? You could send some JSON, right? You could send data, just regular JavaScript data that would be transformed in some other capacity to on the client side, right? And the reality is that all these different types of data will respond in different ways, right? So right now, we're just sending a simple string, but if we think about it, the way that our little application was working, we were sending messages, and the messages were kind of just an array of strings, if you recall, right? We took an array of strings and then we formatted that as messages. So what would happen if I essentially create a little array right here and say, hello from the server, and let's get things connected. Express to cool. So right, so now I have this array being defined. So if I save this, one thing that you're gonna run into when you're working on the server side, there's some libraries that help make this easier for you to manage. But whenever you make a change on the server, you're gonna need to stop and relaunch the server for that change to take effect. So to stop the server, you could just do Control-C. It'll stop the server, stop the process running that server, and then you just run the server one more time. And when you run it, you just got to refresh whatever route is using the server, and then you'll get that new bit of changes. So in my case, I just changed what data was coming back. So you can see now that an array of data is coming back from the server. So I was sending a simple string before. Now I'm sending an actual JSON object because this array of data is considered a JavaScript object data. That's now being transferred back, which is great. So question is, how can I connect this array of data to our little original app that was showing all of these messages, right? Because technically, if I could find a way to get this array of data into this application, right, I can then process this data and show it on the client side. So that's exactly